In this advanced taxation marking video, we're going to be focusing on enhancing your question practice by showing you how to debrief and mark your own answers. My name's Roderick Black and I'm an ACCA expert tutor, and I'm going to guide you through this presentation. It's really important, of course, to practice questions as part of your exam preparation, but it's also really important to appreciate the benefits you'll get from marking your own answers. So what are those benefits? Well, first of all, it allows you to measure your progress. Hopefully, as you do more questions, your marks will go up and you'll see yourself progressing. It helps you to focus on writing points and calculations that actually count for marks, as well as letting you see what is not gaining you any marks. And finally, students who self-mark their own answers do better in the actual exam. What is it that the tax examiner is looking for in a good tax answer? Well, a tax exam question is generally looking for three things from you. First of all, the examiner wants to know, can you identify the tax rules that are relevant to the scenario in the question? In other words, the technical knowledge aspect. He wants you to apply those rules to that scenario to give the conclusion. So when you're marking your own answer, you should be looking for technical knowledge, its application to the scenario, and conclusions, and mark accordingly. Now note, although I've listed these three points there in that order, it doesn't really matter too much if they come in that order in your answer. You might start with a conclusion and then explain why you've got to that by giving the technical knowledge applied to the facts of the scenario. So long as you've got those three things in there, you'll pick up the marks. So how to go about self-marking? Well, of course, each question is broken down into requirements, and you'll be able to see on the question the number of marks for each requirement. When you get to the marking guide, those are broken down further into component parts, and some of those can be quite chunky, maybe 3 marks for a particular component part. You want to aim to break that down and allocate a half or a mark for, as I've said before, technical rules, their application and conclusions. But I suggest you should also award yourself 0 marks for material that you wrote that is either wrong, repeats content of the question, or is not relevant at all to the scenario. That will help focus you on avoiding writing down material that's getting you no marks. Let's get started. We're going to look at 2 parts of one 20-mark ATX question that displays both the written and computational aspects of the platform and show you how to mark the answer for yourself. Now, just to say, we're not aiming to teach you particular tax technical points here. The actual technical content of the questions and the solutions is really not that important. What our aim here is to give you guidance by showing you an example answer and how you would go about marking it so that you can do this for yourself. So I'm going to go to the practice platform, the ACCA practice platform. Okay, here we are in the marking section of the practice platform. And the question we're going to use is question 3 from the June 2019 exam. It's on the practice platform, so you could have a go at this for yourself. But I would point out that even if you're not using the practice platform on some of the answers you're writing to questions, you can still use the marking guide and the principles I outline here to mark your own answer, and you should do that. So let's have a look at the answer I've got here. What I suggest you do first, though, is pause the video and go and read question 3 of the June 2019 exam on the practice platform, and then look at my answer and have a go at marking it for yourself. Okay, you can see that I've pre-populated the answer section, the word processor and the spreadsheet part with the answers to parts A and B of question 3. Let's go about marking this now. Looking at the marking guide for Part A, you can see that the 6 maximum marks, 7 available marks, are broken down into 3 component parts. And in my answer, there is no mention of obtaining recovery of input tax for pre-registration expenditure on goods and services. So sadly, this answer doesn't get any marks for the 3 and 1.5 mark component parts in Part A. So there's 2.5 marks for benefits of voluntary registration, and that's what this answer has got something on. So let's go ahead and mark this. Now I'm going to give, by and large, half a mark or a mark for particular points. So I click the tick button and the half mark. And let's look at this. So we start off by saying, if Dent is registered for VAT and making only taxable supplies, it can recover VAT on its purchases. Okay, that's a statement of tax theory, tax rules, and it's correct. So I'm going to give half a mark for that. Then it goes on to say, including on the machine, but not on the employee's salary costs, as there is no VAT on them. Okay, that's the application of that rule to the facts of the question. That's good. I'm going to give half a mark for that. It says, as the value of its trading receipts is low to begin with, this will probably mean it is in a net VAT repayment position. That's good. That's, again, applying the knowledge to the facts of the question. So I'm going to give half a mark for that. And that will help its cash flow position, which is true. It then goes on to say, as it's making taxable supplies, Dent can register voluntarily, even though its sales are below the VAT registration threshold. Now, that really doesn't add anything because you were told that in the question as a possibility. So I would add 0 for that, just to show it didn't add anything. It then says its customers won't mind being charged VAT if Dent registers voluntarily, as they are VAT registered. Again, that's applying the theory to the facts of the question, meaning they can claim back the VAT Dent charges them. So they're not disadvantaged by Dent registering early and adding VAT to their bills. Okay, that's the application of rules to the scenario. I'm going to give a half mark for that. It then goes on and says, if Dent waits until it has to register, it won't be able to claim back the VAT paid on purchases prior to that date. That's not right. So I'm going to give that a 0, just to show that that wasn't worth anything. And then finally, so the advice is for Dent to voluntarily register for VAT as soon as possible to maximise its VAT recovery and cash flow. There's a slight spelling mistake, but don't worry about that. You won't be penalised for that. Okay, I'm going to give a half mark for that. So overall, I've given this answer 2.5 marks, the full amount of the marks available for the third component. Could have easily been so much better if they'd mentioned something about pre-registration expenditure on goods or services, but it's 2.5 marks for that. Let's move on to the second part, and this was to do with R&D expenditure. You can see in part B on the marking guide, we've got 1 mark for capital expenditure, the explanation, 3.5 marks for the additional deduction for revenue expenditure, explanation, and 2 marks for the calculation. So what do we say in the answer? B is Dent is a small company for R&D, which means it gets an extra 130% deduction. Okay, that's a technical point that's correct. So I'm going to give that half a mark. For its R&D expenditure against its trading profits, that is also technically correct. That's where you get the deduction in computing trading profits. So I'm going to give half a mark for that. It then says this applies to the revenue expenditure, property costs, consumable and staff costs, but not the pension costs. Now that's an attempt to apply this to the facts of the question, but whilst I can give half a mark for the revenue expenditure point, because that's what you get the 130% deduction on the application to the facts of the question, it's really not very specific. In particular, they have missed the agency point and the pension cost point is wrong. So I'm going to give 0 at that point. Okay. Now, We've still to get to the calculation. I'll get to the spreadsheet in a minute, but just if we finish reading what's written here, for the specialist equipment, a special 100% R&D capital allowance is given. Note the expenditure must relate to the R&D activity. Well, that's of general application, and it's a fair point. But I'm going to give a mark, the whole mark, from the marking guide for the capital expenditure point, because that's very good. Got that completely right. So they got the mark for capital expenditure explanation component on the marking guide. And for explanation of the additional deduction for revenue expenditure, I've given 1.5 marks out of 3.5. Just didn't get enough correct. Some bits wrong and some bits missed out. Let's go to the spreadsheet and look at the calculation. Now, in these kind of questions, you've got to watch you're not awarding yourself marks twice over. So we've given 1.5 marks, but there's some stuff they missed out and some stuff they got wrong. What about here? Well, some of this is pretty good. It's 2 marks available, but you can see that they've applied the 130% to everything, including the capital expenditure, which sort of contradicts what they wrote in the written answer. So I gave a mark for that there. I can't give anything here. In fact, it's wrong in that regard. But they did bring in some of the right costs here, just it wasn't completely enough. But I've penalised them in the written bit for the mistakes made there. I don't feel I can give them the full 2 marks, but I'm going to give them 1 mark. So in this part of the question, they got 1 mark out of the 2, and on the previous written part, they got 1.5 out of the 2. So overall, and they got the 1 mark for capital expenditure. So overall in this part B, they got 1, if I go back, 2, 3.5 out of 6. So just a pass. And for part A, they got 1, 2.5 out of 6. So just slightly under a fail there, but overall, bang on half marks. How did your marking compare to mine? What did they do that was good? On certain parts of the answer, they did very well. What did they do that was not so good? Here, missed out quite big chunks, could easily improve their performance if they'd addressed some of these component parts that were missed out. We've reached the end of this session now. I hope you've picked up some useful tips that will help you when marking and reviewing your own answers. Remember, doing this will enhance your performance in the actual exam. Good luck, and thanks for watching.